Good evening. I'm Ali Velshi. Tonight, President Trump has just been confronted with the biggest test of his presidency to date. If you're just catching up with us, here's the breaking news that the whole world is following. Iran launched a ballistic missile attack at two Iraqi bases, which house U.S. troops in the early hours of Wednesday morning, local time. More than a dozen missiles struck the Al-Assad base and another air base in Erbil, both in Iraq. Now, so far, it seems that there were no casualties. Sunlight has just arrived in that area of the world, so there is an investigation going on. But U.S. military sources said troops were given enough warning to reach shelter before the missiles struck. The attacks were Iran's response to the U.S. killing last week of the top Iranian general, this man, Qasem Soleimani, in Baghdad. Iran has called that attack an act of war and state terrorism, and it has vowed a response. Now, after the attacks, Iran Foreign Minister Javad Zarif tweeted early Wednesday morning that Iran did not seek escalation of war. President Trump has not issued a formal statement or addressed the nation since this strike, but he did tweet, of course. On Twitter, the president said, quote, "All is well." Missiles launched from Iran at two military bases located in Iraq. Assessment of casualties and damages taking place right now. So far, so good. We have the most powerful and well-equipped military anywhere in the world by far. I will be making a statement tomorrow morning. Flights have been diverted from Iranian and Iraqi airspace, and other countries with troops based in Iraq for the fight against ISIS have been closely monitoring the situation. Starting us off tonight is NBC News international correspondent Cal Perry, who joins us from nearby Doha, Qatar. And I want to provide some context to our viewers, Cal. You are in one of those places that houses more than 10,000 U.S. troops. There is an air base in Qatar. It is a forward operating air base for the Americans, which puts that base and people around there within the sights and makes them possible targets of Iran when they have said that they will target U.S. military installations in the area. However, Qatar is one of those few Arab countries that enjoys good relations with Iran.
Yeah, they were the first to send a diplomat to Iran after General Soleimani was assassinated. But as you say, these countries in the Gulf who for so long took these U.S. bases as a sign of safety are now sort of dealing with the realization that, in fact, it probably makes them a target. In the middle of that airstrike that ballistic missile strike from the Iranians, we were watching Iranian state television and these warnings started coming across. And the most stark warning for the Gulf countries was anybody who assists the U.S. military in attack on Iran will be held responsible and their country will be a target. That is directed at Kuwait, at Oman, at Bahrain, at Saudi Arabia, all of which have a large U.S. military presence. So what we're going to see now, I think, is a real reassessment on behalf of these governments about their relationship with the U.S. military. It's also important to note, Ali, as you sort of laid out the timeline of this attack, these missiles left Iran. This was via the Iranian military. This was not a proxy attack. This was an attack that the Iranian government immediately took responsibility for, an indication that they are really trying to satisfy domestic consumption and hit back. This took place while General Soleimani was being buried, and in fact, we now understand that the Iranians dubbed this Operation Martyr Soleimani. Ali?
The question, of course, as we heard from Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, who, by the way, was trying to be in the United States this week and has not been granted a visa, which is in violation of what the United States is supposed to do when it comes to the United Nations. Javad Zarif has said this was our retaliation. We're not looking for escalation. Did you read into that the Iranians are saying we're done? We sent missiles to two bases to show you that we can, and we believe that's what we needed to do in exchange for you killing Qasem Soleimani? Because the last couple of days in Iran, with the funeral of Qasem Soleimani and the fiery speeches at the mosques, have sounded substantially more serious than what we may have witnessed in the last few hours.
Yeah, and those comments from the foreign minister were backed up by Iranian state television, who said, "We are done. This was our response, and unless the U.S. responds, that's it." Now, they did say if the U.S. responds, basically all hell will break loose. Hezbollah will become involved. Haifa, they said, will become a target. Dubai will be targeted, which, again, is terrifying for people both in Israel and here in the Gulf. But the understanding now from the Iranians, and they've been very clear about this, is that they are finished with their retaliation, at least the Iranian government. I can't speak for, and we have not heard from these proxy groups, but it is an indication that I think for the first time, really, in 5 or 6 days, the rhetoric is actually tamping down. We've seen this bombastic rhetoric from both the U.S. president and the Iranian regime. I mean, the U.S. president saying that he would act in a disproportionate manner and that he would strike cultural sites was viewed by the Iranians as akin to what ISIS did in Syria. And the Iranians, for their part, the same kind of bombastic rhetoric that they could flatten Israel, that they would light fire to these Gulf nations. It was that comment by Zarif, I think, that in the middle of the night here, when tensions were really high, when people were waking up in the Gulf and turning on their TVs, when people in Dubai were, frankly, thinking about maybe getting out of town, it was that comment by Javad Zarif that really did sort of lower the tension. The question now is, will the next inflection point be when we hear from President Trump when the sun comes up in the United States, Ali?
Yeah, it is worth noting that there was a reference by the Iranians to Dubai and Haifa being places that could be targeted. So we're going to examine that a little more closely. I'm grateful, as I always am when we have breaking news, Cal, to have you on the other side making sense of it for us, and we're going to be relying on you over the course of the next few hours. We are not leaving air. We are going to cover this completely until the Middle East is awake and America is awake to understand what happens next. Cal Perry joining us from Doha, Qatar. Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia in the Obama administration, joins us now. He's an NBC News and MSNBC national security analyst. Nayyera Huck is the host of Sirius XM Progress and a former senior advisor at the State Department. Former Republican Congressman David Jolly joins us as well. Nayyera, let me just start with you because Cal has said something interesting, and that is that this may, according to Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, be the reaction to what happened to Qasem Soleimani. It may be the completeness of the reaction if America doesn't do something else. But Qasem Soleimani was not thought of as a man that we might think of as our generals in the military. He operated all of these militias and these proxy forces and these other pro-Iranian groups that operated in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and in other places. Do we know, do you think that this is the end of the response, or do you think those groups still have response in them?
Listen, Javad Zarif, as foreign minister, is clearly looking to find a diplomatic off-ramp to this current cycle of rhetoric and belligerence between the United States and Iran. That's part of why he said this was proportionate and concluded. But that's this most immediate cycle in which we had a U.S. contractor killed, the Iranian government official, who also happens to be the leader of a massive terrorist network, killed by the United States. So in that sense, Trump can wake up tomorrow morning and claim this as a U.S. victory. So both sides can save face. Both sides can look strong to their own domestic audiences. That does not change the fact that Iran is very adept at asymmetric warfare and the non-conventional ways of attack. They can do a cyber attack. They will look at other, if not U.S. installations, then U.S. allies. They will likely at some point, if not tomorrow, but they will bide their time and they will continue their terrorist activity. So it's a matter of not now, but when, and looking at having a proper strategy of containment, even though now the United States has zero diplomatic relationship with Iran and is slowly losing any credibility on the world stage of being able to contain Iran.
But let me put the diplomat on the channel here on the spot. Ambassador McFaul, Zarif is trying to have a diplomatic channel. There are many Americans who are trying. We don't have traditional diplomatic channels with Iran, although the Iran nuclear deal in 2005 went some distance toward establishing that, because for 10 years, but at least the last 2 years, people like John Kerry and Federica Mogherini were in a room with Javad Zarif and developed remarkable close personal relationships with people who started off with great animosity. So there are people in Iran and people in the United States who believe there is another way than what we have seen unfold in the last few days. Tell me what you think the likelihood and possibility of that way, of diplomacy playing a role now in the de-escalation of what we have watched for the last 72 hours.
Well, I'd say there's the short-term de-escalation of this current crisis and the longer-term problems that we have in our U.S. Iranian relations. With respect to the short term, it's great that he put that tweet out. I wonder if any other tweet has been so important in terms of diplomacy. But wouldn't it be great if somebody picked up the phone and called the foreign minister and talked to him? And Secretary Kerry used to do that. We're not doing that now, and I think that's a mistake. We do not want to have any kind of conflict based on misperception. But the broader point of diplomacy, I think, is dead. I think if we talk about the broader strategy that Trump has approached, he has decided that pressure is going to achieve our foreign policy objectives in the region vis-a-vis Iran, and that is to make our forces safe, to reduce their influence in the region, and to deny them a bomb. And on all three of those core U.S. objectives, I would say we're farther away today than we were 3 years ago. And I don't see a course of action that gets us onto a path, a diplomatic path, to help us achieve those objectives, which I think, by the way, Democrats and Republicans would agree should be the core objectives of American diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran.
Right. David Jolly, whether or not one liked the Iran nuclear deal, and I happen to believe there are reasons to like it and reasons not to like it, it was the product of over a decade of work, and it came to fruition after the United States sort of arrived at the table very seriously, imposed some financial sanctions on Iran, sort of brought them to their knees financially and said, OK, we're ready to talk. We now have a situation where, and I may be able to show our viewers this map of all the U.S. troops in the area, how many U.S. troops there are in the region. But to that count, in Kuwait, there are 13,000. To that count, we are adding, I think, 3,900 more airborne troops, 82nd Airborne troops. We have a lot of people in a region that Americans are not necessarily supportive of us having a remarkable presence there. It would strike me that that diplomatic ways of getting our troops out of the Middle East is something that Americans of all political stripes would favor.
Yes, and largely for Republicans, that would require you to believe that there is a diplomatic solution or opportunity with Iran. And this is the curious bent under Donald Trump's administration that the Republicans are taking. There was a legitimate case against the Iran deal. Frankly, even those in the Obama administration said it was the least bad solution. And so the Republican counterpoint at the time was that, look, you are providing financial assistance to Iran, and you are ultimately creating a nuclear pathway over the next 25 or 30 years. The Obama administration said, yes, but this provides for a safer, more stable region over those 25 to 30 years. What we have seen from the Republicans, particularly Pompeo, though, is this very hardline, almost drumbeat of war alternative to the Iran deal. Not simply a recognition that, look, we are going to work towards perhaps an adversarial role with Iran, but at least one that provides greater stability and keeps Iran in check. And I think that's the great concern and the big question for what Donald Trump says tomorrow. Because what we saw answered tonight, we believe at least, is Iran had to approach questions of whether or not to engage in lethality, which apparently they did not. We will find out when the day breaks, but it appears to not be a mass casualty event. They had to determine whether it hit infrastructure, which apparently they did, or hit cyber. So tomorrow morning, if the lay of the land for the Trump administration is they took out Soleimani and we had an infrastructure hit, the opportunity for Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo is to simply say, okay, let's let things stay where they are. But that is where we have a very irascible and unpredictable president. And I think the world hopes that he takes the more stable approach tomorrow, not the escalation.
Very interesting observation, though, David Jolly. The president did not make a comment tonight. There was some expectation that he would have made a comment tonight. And I'm wondering whether this is a situation in which cooler heads have prevailed and said, wait till the morning. Let's have a damage assessment and let's see what a proportionate response if any, looks like, or whether de-escalation should be the point. Nayyera, you know, again, I point out that Javad Zarif was supposed to be in New York this week. The United States has an obligation to issue visas to representatives of other governments when they're coming for UN business. We did not do that. So we're not showing that we want to move forward, as Ambassador McFaul said, on the diplomatic front. However, for those people who didn't like the Iran deal when it was done, as David said, who said it's the least bad arrangement, what you saw from this president from day one, before he was elected, is he said he would rip up that deal, but there hasn't been any presentation of what something else looks like. To this moment, there hasn't been some alternative presented for how we are going to deal with Iran, whether you think they're a bad actor or a potential nuclear power.
Ron, you started this administration with then National Security Advisor Flynn putting Iran on notice, and you had rhetoric coming from John Bolton about regime change, and he was tweeting just this week about it's time for regime change. So President Trump, even though he campaigned on ending wars and bringing back troops from the Middle East, had surrounded himself with war hawks and real hardliners when it came to what's necessary for Iran. We've had this schizophrenia in the administration's policy for 3 years, and at this point, President Trump has to own his foreign policy and what's happened in the region. It can no longer be Obama made this mistake. Actually, in 2015, in the speech in which he announced the Iran deal, President Obama said, it's either diplomacy or war. Like, these are the two options we have. And this is the challenge we face with Trump and his itchy Twitter fingers and his thin skin, is that he takes the bait very quickly and reacts disproportionately. There's an opportunity to de-escalate now, but that doesn't necessarily change the fact that we don't have a plan or a process or even an end goal in sight that has been shared with Congress and the American public.
It would be very interesting to see if one of those things developed in the next 24 hours. Thank you to you, Nayyera Huq, and to Michael McFaul, Ambassador Michael McFaul, and David Jolly. Coming up next.